And insomnia is essentially diagnosed as falling asleep during the middle of the day due to lack of sleep at nighttime.
Oh, okay.
But many people who are having trouble sleeping at night are not falling asleep during the middle of the day. They're dealing with grogginess or crankiness or other effects of having fragmented sleep.
Dr. Huberman's insight into the impact of fragmented sleep on performance is eye-opening. Many of us struggle with this issue in today's fast-paced world, and it's time to prioritize our sleep hygiene. This video is a powerful reminder of the importance of a good night's sleep and offers practical tips to optimize our rest. Let's commit to better sleep and unlock our full potential.
We need to sleep enough. Now, what's enough sleep? This is an interesting question. Enough sleep has been argued it's 6 hours. Other people it's 7 hours. Other people it's 8 hours. It's basically waking up without an alarm clock and feeling rested. You know, getting better at sleeping is a whole set of practices. But sleep is a slow tool. It's not a real-time tool. Because if you're feeling exhausted and you have to get up and have your day, deal with children, deal with work, deal with life, we can talk about how to get better at sleeping, but in real time, what you want to do is you want to bring more alertness into the system. Focus and alertness. The way to do that is to take advantage of a very well-established medical fact. All medical students learn this, all MDs know this, which is that there's a direct relationship between how you breathe and your heart rate. And so when we inhale, it almost feels like everything's moving up. But actually what happens is our diaphragm moves down. Okay, so when we inhale, our diaphragm moves down. When that happens, our heart literally gets a little bit bigger. The volume of the heart gets a little bit bigger, which means that whatever blood in there is moving per unit time a little bit slower. And there's a set of neurons in the heart called the sinoatrial node that sends a signal to the brain and says, hey, blood flow is slowing down. And the brain sends a signal back to the heart and says, okay, let's speed up, and speeds up the heart rate. So the short, concise way to put it is when you inhale more vigorously or longer, you're speeding up your heart rate. As you inhale, you're sending a neural signal to your heart to speed up. And when you exhale, the diaphragm moves up, the heart gets a little bit smaller, literally because there's less space there. Then there's a signal sent to the brain, and the brain sends a signal back and says, slow down the heart rate. Longer or more vigorous inhales will speed up your heart rate and make you more alert. Longer or more vigorous exhales will slow down your heart rate and make you less alert.
Wow.
This is the basis of heart rate variability. When people talk about heart rate variability is good, you know that you don't want your heart rate to be one level all day, high or low. A lot of people don't realize that. They think, oh, I got a nice slow heart rate. But you don't want your heart rate to be like this. You want your heart rate to go through these fluctuations. Heart rate variability is good.
Why?
Because heart rate variability reflects the activation of what's typically called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the brain's ability to slow down and calm the nervous system. So when your heart rate is going like this, it means that your heart rate is speeding up and then your brain is slowing it down. Your heart rate is speeding it up and your brain is slowing it down. And that's what's happening all day long as you're moving through things in a kind of calm, alert way. Most people are aware that getting a really good night's sleep on a consistent basis is critically important, but most people don't know how to do that. In fact, I'm guessing that very few of you out there are consistently getting 7 to 9 hours of really terrific sleep, waking up feeling rested, like you're ready to attack the day, and being able to go through the day feeling focused and alert without dips in energy or focus. So what determines how well we sleep and the quality of our wakeful state? Turns out that's governed by two forces. The first force is a chemical force. It's called adenosine. Adenosine is a molecule in our nervous system and body that builds up the longer we are awake. So if you've just slept for 8 or 9 or 10 really deep restful hours, adenosine is going to be very low in your brain and body. If, however, you've been awake for 10, 15 or more hours, adenosine levels are going to be much higher. Adenosine creates a sort of sleep drive or a sleep hunger. We can think of it in an analogous way to nutrition. Your nutrition and how well you feel after you eat certain foods, your overall level of fitness and your cellular health and your heart health isn't governed by any one food item that you might eat or not eat. It's governed by a number of different factors: how often you eat, how much you eat, which items you eat, etc., and what works best for you. In the same way, your sleep and your wakefulness are the product of kind of the average of a number of different behaviors. How long you've been awake is a key one because of this molecule adenosine. So the reason you get sleepy when you've been up for a while is because adenosine is creeping up steadily the longer you've been awake. And a good way to remember this and think about adenosine is to think about caffeine. Caffeine, for most people, except a very small percentage of people, wakes them up. It makes them feel more alert. When you ingest caffeine, whether or not it's coffee or soda or tea or in any other form, it binds to the adenosine receptor. It sort of parks there, just like a car would park in a given parking slot, and therefore adenosine can't park in that slot. Now, when caffeine parks in the adenosine receptor slot, nothing really happens downstream of that receptor. The receptor can't engage the normal cellular functions of making that cell and you feel sleepy. So the reason caffeine wakes you up is because it blocks the sleepiness receptor. It blocks the sleepy signal. And this is why when that caffeine wears off, adenosine will bind to that receptor, sometimes with even greater what we call affinity, and you feel the crash. You feel especially tired. However, if you've ever pulled an all-nighter, you'll notice something interesting. As morning rolls around, you'll suddenly feel an increase in your energy and alertness again, even though adenosine has been building up for the entire night. Why is that? The reason that is because there's a second force which is governing when you sleep and when you're awake. And that force is a so-called circadian force. Circadian means about a day or about 24 hours. And inside all of us is a clock that exists in your brain and my brain and the brain of every animal that we're aware of that determines when we want to be sleepy and when we want to be awake. But the most powerful thing that's governing when you want to be asleep and when you want to be awake is light. And in particular, it's governed by sunlight. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important and how actionable this relationship is between light and when you want to sleep. So let's just break it down from the standpoint of what's going on in your brain and body as you go through one 24-hour day. Let's start with waking. So regardless of how well you slept at night or whether or not you were up all night, most people tend to wake up sometime around when the sun rises. Maybe not right at sunrise, but within an hour or two or maybe 3 of sunrise. But for most people, we tend to wake up about the time that the sun is rising or so. And as we do that, adenosine levels tend to be low if we've been asleep, for reasons that you now understand. And our system generates an internal signal that is in the form of a hormone. The definition of a hormone is it's a substance, a chemical, that's released from one organ in your body that goes and acts on other organs elsewhere in your body, including your nervous system. When you wake up in the morning, you wake up because a particular hormone called cortisol is released from your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands sit right above your kidneys, and there's a little pulse of cortisol. Here's how it goes. You've got this clock above the roof of your mouth that churns out this 24-hour rhythm and is communicated to all the other organs and tissues of your body. But there's another structure, has a cool name. It's called the intergeniculate leaflet, which sits a few millimeters away in the brain, and it's involved in regulating the clock output through what's called non-photic, non-light type influences like exercise and feeding, etc. So if you are not feeling awake during the day and you're having trouble sleeping, get the sunlight exposure that we just talked about. But in addition to that, if you want to become an early riser, for instance, and you want to feel more awake during the early part of the day, by getting that light exposure and exercising early in the day, you will, after 2 or 3 days, you will naturally start to wake up earlier in the day. And that's because these clock mechanisms have shifted. It's like setting the clock earlier as opposed to delaying the clock. There was a really nice study that showed that viewing sunlight around the time of sunset, doesn't have to be just crossing the horizon, but circa sunset, within an hour or so of sunset, prevents some of the bad effects of light in preventing melatonin release later that same night. Viewing light early in the day is key. Viewing light later in the day when the sun is setting or around that time can help protect these mechanisms, your brain and body, against the negative effects of light later in the day. You'd go view the sunset, or you would go outside in the late afternoon or evening. Again, if you safely can do that with sunglasses off, you will. If you need to wear sunglasses, fine, but it will take probably 100 to 1,000 times longer with dark sunglasses than if you take them off. So the best thing to do is just to get outside for a few minutes, anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes, also in the afternoon. Having those two signals arriving to your central clock, that your body, your internal world knows when it's morning and knows when it's evening, is tremendously powerful. There's always a lot of questions about how long, how much, how do I know if I've had enough? You'll know because your rhythm will start to fall into some degree of normalcy. You'll start to wake up at more or less the same time each day. You'll fall asleep more easily at night. Generally, it takes about 2 or 3 days for these systems to align. So if you've not been doing these behaviors, it's going to take a few days, but they can have tremendous benefits, and sometimes rather quickly, on a number of different mental and physical aspects of your health. But there are a bunch of other things that are downstream of cortisol and melatonin. Like, we tend to be hungrier during our wakeful period than late at night. Some people like to eat it late at night, but if you're finding that you can't become a day person or a morning person, shifting your light exposure, exercise, and food intake to the daytime will help. Some people like to stop eating around 6 or 8 p.m. because of metabolic reasons, or they're trying to maintain their weight or lose weight. That's actually not supported so well by the literature. The literature around nutrition essentially says that it's best to restrict your feeding to a certain period of each 24-hour cycle, to not be eating around the clock. If you turn on the lights before waking up, so around 45 minutes to an hour before waking up, even if your eyelids are closed, provided you're not under the covers, after doing that for a few days, that increases your total sleep time and shifts forward the time at which you feel sleepy. It makes you want to go to bed earlier each night. Just think about it. We don't go through the day wanting to fall asleep every 30 minutes and then feeling like we're wide awake. Our sleep and our period of sleepiness tends to be condensed into one block, typically one 6 to 10 hour block, although there's also variation in terms of how much people want to sleep. Even through the eyelids, before these kids woke up, then made those kids naturally want to go to bed earlier, and they ended up sleeping longer. So that's something you could try. You could put your lights on a timer to go on early in the day before you wake up. You could open your blinds so that sunlight is coming through. And again, if you curl up under the covers, then it's not going to reach these neurons. But it's remarkable the light can actually penetrate the eyelids, activate these neurons, and go to the central clock. Whenever people ask me, what should I take, which is one of the most common questions I get, what supplements should I take? What drugs should I be taking? What things should I be taking? The first question I always ask them is, how's your sleep? And 90% of the time, they tell me they either have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, or they don't feel rested throughout the day. For some of you, naps are great. I love taking naps. Some people, they wake up from naps feeling really groggy. That's probably because they're not sleeping as well as they should at night, or as long as they should at night. And so they're dropping into REM sleep or deeper forms of sleep in the daytime. And then they wake up and they feel kind of disoriented. So a period of time each day that you devote to getting better at falling and staying asleep is actually a really good practice to adopt. The other thing about these practices like meditation, yoga nidra, and hypnosis is people always say to me, well, when should I do them? And I always say, well, the best time of day to do it is when you first wake up in the morning, anytime you wake up in the middle of the night, or any time of day. In other words, they're always good for you because it's a training mechanism by which you self-train your nervous system to go from a state of heightened alertness that you don't want to heightened relaxation that you do want. And so it's really teaching you to hit the brake. We've all experienced that we can stay up if we want to, right? If we want to stay up late on New Year's, or we want to push an all-nighter, some people can do that more easily than others, but we're all capable of doing that. But it's very hard to make ourselves fall asleep. And so there's a sort of asymmetry to the way our autonomic nervous system, which governs this alertness, calmness thing, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, there's an asymmetry there where we are more easily able to engage wakefulness and drive wakefulness, we can force ourselves to stay awake, then we are able to force ourselves to fall asleep. And one of the things that I say over and over again, and I'm going to continue to say over and over again, is it's very hard to control the mind with the mind. When you have trouble falling asleep, you need to look to some mechanism that involves the body. And all the things I described, meditation, hypnosis, yoga nidra, all involve exhale emphasized breathing, certain ways of lying down and controlling the body. But all of those involve using the body to control the mind rather than trying to, wrestle your mind into a certain pattern of relaxation. And when we're having trouble controlling the mind, I encourage people to look towards the body. Look toward sunlight. Avoid sunlight and bright light if that happens to be late at night. So there's a theme that's starting to emerge, which is in order to control this thing that we call the nervous system, we have to look back to some of the things we discussed earlier, like sensation, perception, etc. But we have to ask, what can we control? Well, I'm talking about controlling light exposure, controlling your breathing and body. Any of those are really teaching you to use your body to control your mind and to allow you to explore the mind-body relationship in a way that gives you more control over your mind and the mind-body relationship. Usually I find that people are not serious, meaning they want an answer, but they don't want to do the work.
Right. Yeah.
Dr. Huberman's message is clear. Having dreams is great, but it's the effort that counts, You can't escape hard work needed to achieve your goals, but you gotta be willing to accept those hits, to take them and make the first step. So let your dreams guide you, but let your actions define you. Believe in yourself, take action, and never give up, for that's the path to achieving your dreams.
It's really simple. Can you not eat until 2 p.m.? I was like, yeah, I'm not hungry in the morning. I'm like, great, drink coffee, drink water, and in the morning get up and just get on, either run or get on some exercise bike and just pedal like someone's chasing you with a syringe full of poison. So, and the reason I felt any, sense of agency in giving this information is, I've done a bunch of different things in neuroscience related to vision and neuroplasticity and stress, but I've done some work and continue to do some work with special operations and some of these groups that are interested in how you use biology to improve human performance over long periods of time. Okay, so basketball players, military, these kinds of things. And so there's a pretty straightforward formula where when you've been asleep all night, your fuel reserves, like you've got fuel in your fat, you guys don't have any of that, but you got fuel in your fat, you've got fuel in your muscles that can be burned, and you got fuel in your liver, it's called glycogen. And when you wake up early, all of that is as low as it's going to be because you haven't been eating anything.
Gotcha.
And so if you exercise then, your body starts dropping into your body fat stores quicker. Look, do it fasted, and then continue to hydrate, and then eat your first meal in the afternoon.
Dr. Huberman knows the importance of starting your engine in the morning to get rid of unwanted fat. Working with special operations, he understands the need to move and burn fuel. In this video, you're going to discover why it's crucial to kickstart your metabolism early.
Very few people can just take the menu and just do it, right?
Right.
The beauty of being young is that neuroplasticity, your nervous system's ability to change in response to experience, to learn things, is at its absolute peak. However, you don't have that much control over your life when you're young, right? Especially when you're really young. As you get older, it gets harder to change your nervous system, but you can do it. But the advantage you have is that you can direct exactly what changes you want to happen. And so there are two different ways to change your nervous system depending on whether or not you're younger or you're older. And it's not like the gate drops right at 25.
Okay.
It just tapers off. If somebody is an adult, you can't change their mind.
Right.
You literally can't. They have to make the decision to do that. Parallel pathways, as the name suggests, are pathways. They could be neural pathways or hormonal pathways or otherwise that operate independently of one another to accomplish a common goal. First of all, I'm a big proponent and consumer of yerba mate. Yerba mate is a tea that can promote the release of glucagon-like peptide 1. And there are also new prescription drugs that are now hitting the market, and for which there are really impressive clinical trials for diabetes and obesity that are essentially glucagon-like peptide 1 stimulators. So they stimulate the release of that, or they are in fact a synthetic version of glucagon-like peptide 1. What is glucagon-like peptide 1? It is a peptide, which is a small little protein that can dramatically suppress appetite. So that's why these drugs are being explored and are showing quite impressive results for things like treatment of type 2 diabetes and other forms of diabetes, as well as obesity. So they lead to weight loss. Now, in terms of the yerba mate stimulation of glucagon-like peptide 1, that's going to be a much lower amount of glucagon-like peptide 1 that's released from drinking yerba mate, as opposed to, say, taking a drug that stimulates GLP-1 or taking a drug that is GLP-1. Nonetheless, I should also point out that yerba mate comes in a bunch of different forms. There is some concern about certain smoky flavored forms of yerba mate being carcinogenic. So that's why I avoid those forms of yerba mate. But for me, yerba mate is one of the preferred sources of caffeine. For me, I like the way it tastes. It does provide that sort of caffeine kick that I like to have early in the day for focus and for work and for exercise. And yet I actively avoid the smoked varieties of yerba mate because of the potential carcinogenic effects of the smoked varieties. Glucagon-like peptide 1, as I mentioned earlier, can suppress appetite. It does that by at least two mechanisms through parallel pathways. Glucagon-like peptide 1 acts on receptors in the body in a portion of the nervous system called the enteric nervous system. This is a component of your nervous system that you don't really have control over. It's autonomic or automatic. GLP-1 binds to what are called intestinofugal enteric neurons. You don't need to know the name, but those neurons do two things. First of all, they cause some gut distension. So they actually make you feel full. This is incredible, right? A peptide, not actual physical food, but a peptide that stimulates neurons that cause changes in the so-called mechanoreceptors of the gut of the enteric nervous system and make people feel full. So it can lead to actually mild, or I suppose if levels of GLP-1 are very high, to major gut distension. Okay, I think that the levels of GLP-1 that would come from drinking yerba mate and hopefully from appropriate dosaging of the synthetic forms of GLP-1 or drugs that stimulate GLP-1 would cause mild, not major gut distension, because major gut distension would be uncomfortable. So GLP-1 is acting at the level of gut to increase gut distension, and by way of a pathway that goes from the gut up to the hypothalamus, this little cluster of neurons about the size of a marble that sits above the roof of your mouth, is also suppressing appetite through brain mechanisms. So this is really beautiful, right? You have a peptide, a small little protein that's released in the gut, and that release within the gut causes gut distension, which makes you feel full, and by way of neural stimulation of the hypothalamus, also activates neural pathways within the brain that trigger satiety, the feeling of having had enough food. So to me, GLP-1 is both impressive and important. Why? Because this recent category of drugs that's now hitting the market seems to adjust obesity or can help people with weight loss in order to help their health. And it's doing so by at least two mechanisms. One is within the brain, and the other is within the gut and communication through the so-called gut-brain axis. But at the same time, things like yerba mate, and I'm sure there are other compounds out there as well, but certainly yerba mate can stimulate the release of GLP-1. So for those of you that are looking for some mild appetite suppression and want to accomplish that while also ingesting caffeine, yerba mate might be a good option for that. And then for everybody, not just those that are interested in appetite suppression, I think it's important to understand that these parallel pathways are fundamental to how we are organized. Another good example of this would be when we are excited by something, positive or negative, so it could be stressful or we're positively aroused, there is a parallel activation of epinephrine, adrenaline, both from your adrenals and from an area in the brain called the locus ceruleus. So again and again, we see this in biology and in neuroscience, that your brain and your body are acting in concert. They're acting together through mechanisms that either are independent, so separately in the brain and separately in the body, but directed towards a common goal, or through communication between brain and body. And almost always, that communication is going to be bidirectional, body to brain and brain to body. Most of what you see out there on the internet focuses more on what you could eat and should eat or shouldn't eat. It concentrates on exercise, but the burn factor, your thermogenic environment, is one of the, if not the most important factors in this business of fat loss. What I'd like you to know is that this is a two-part process. One is fat mobilization, and the second is fat oxidation or utilization, okay? So the first thing that has to happen for body fat to get burned up or used and reduced is that it has to get mobilized. You just have to move that fat out of the position that it's in. You have to get it out of the fat cells. All right, fat cells can be visceral around our viscera, our organs, or they can be subcutaneous under our skin. So here's the deal. Basically, stored fat has two parts that are relevant here. It's got the fatty acid part, and that's the part that your body can use, and that's attached to something called glycerol, and they're linked by a backbone. So the first step is to get those fatty acids moving around in the bloodstream, to get them out of those fat cells, and then they can travel and be used for energy. The second part is oxidation, is then those fatty acids, those are potential fuel. They're just potential fuel, but you haven't burned the fat yet. You've just moved it out of your fat cells. They're going to go into cells that can use them for energy. And once they are inside those cells, they're still not burned up. You need to oxidize them. Think oxidation is the burn up part. They need to be moved into the mitochondria, and then they can be converted into ATP, into energy. So just to really zoom out again to make sure I don't lose anybody, you got to mobilize the fat, then you have to oxidize the fat. You have to, in other words, you have to mobilize it, then you actually have to convert it into energy. So let's talk about how to use cold and how to leverage shiver as a particularly strong stimulus to increase fat loss through mobilization and oxidation of these fatty acids. So in recent years, there's been a growing interest in the use of cold for various things like improving stress tolerance, improving metabolism, recovery from exercise. But most people out there are using cold exposure, typically by taking cold showers or by getting into cold water of some other kind, a lake or a river or a cold bath or an ice bath. And they are doing that probably with mixed goals, meaning they both would like to increase their metabolism and burn fat, as well as improve mental resilience. So we have several kinds of fat, 3 kinds in fact. We have white fat, white adipose tissue, and we have brown fat or brown adipose tissue. And there's a third kind, which is beige adipose tissue. White fat is the type that we traditionally think of as fat, subcutaneous fat. And it is not particularly rich in mitochondria. It is there as an energy storage site. And we have to mobilize the fat out, as we talked about before, and burn it up elsewhere. Brown fat largely exists between our shoulder blades and on the back of our neck, and it's rich with mitochondria, which is why it's called brown fat. Beige fat is sort of in between. It's white fat that could be brown fat because it has some mitochondria in it, but not as many as brown fat. Now, cold exposure does several things. Making ourselves cold can allow us to build up mental resilience, because getting into cold of any kind, doesn't matter if it's a cryo chamber, doesn't matter if it's a cold day and you forgot your sweater or your parka, it doesn't matter if it's an ice bath or you're lying down in the snow. Cold causes the release of adrenaline from your adrenals, and it causes the release of epinephrine from these neurons that connect to fat. Now, the big effects of cold on metabolism and fat burning are going to be through 2 routes. One is that if you expose yourself to cold, you have the opportunity to trigger activation of brown fat, as well as to convert more beige fat into true brown fat. So you essentially create a stronger or a hotter furnace. That's the way to think about brown fat. It's like a furnace. And so with this principle that we started with of calories in versus calories burned, what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of burning, you're increasing the burn of energy by increasing the intensity of the heat inside you, so to speak. No matter who you are, it's probably not a good idea to be really large. It's actually, any large animal lives less long than the smaller version of that same animal. And it's because of the dosing of this one gene called insulin growth factor. Okay. So Andre the Giant died young. People that have acromegaly, the forehead ridge and the huge hands, they don't live very long because all their organs are huge. Everything that extends your life has to do with keeping a lighter weight. Now, there's nothing wrong with putting on a little bit of extra muscle if you want to be stronger for whatever reason. Yeah. But when you get past a certain point, it does shorten your life. There's no question about it, because it's like a second puberty. Yeah. Right? And the fastest rate of aging that you will ever go through at any stage is puberty. You need sleep to replenish testosterone eventually. But the real question is, are you enjoying what you're doing?
Dr. Huberman's enlightening revelation reminds us that our body's natural chemistry is a very delicate balance, wherein dopamine and testosterone levels are closely intertwined. This video offers invaluable insight into understanding the true value of maintaining that harmony.
If you're viewing bright light in the middle of the night, you are suppressing dopamine release. If you're suppressing dopamine release, you are suppressing testosterone levels. Most people don't really understand how powerful this relationship is between light, dopamine, hormones, and all the great things that the sex steroid hormones do when they're available in your body in the proper ratios. There's a fascinating relationship between the hormone system and the nervous system. And hormones work in general on slower time scales. The definition of a hormone is something is a chemical released at one location in the body, goes and acts at multiple locations far away and within the body. Neurochemicals like dopamine and serotonin tend to work a little more quickly. There are hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that can work very fast, but here I'm referring mainly to testosterone in humans and in animals. There's a very interesting relationship between testosterone and dopamine that speaks directly to what we're talking about now. So dopamine and testosterone are closely related in the pituitary system. And obviously testosterone comes from the adrenals and from the testes. But the major effect of testosterone is to make effort feel good. That's what testosterone does. It has other effects too, right? Reproductive effects, androgenizing parts of the body, etc. But it makes effort feel good. The testosterone molecule is synthesized from cholesterol. Cholesterol can either be made into cortisol, a stress hormone, or testosterone, but not both. So you have a limited amount of cholesterol, and it gets diverted towards stress or towards this pathway where effort feels good. That's the pathway you want to get into. The anger pathway, if we were to just kind of play a mind experiment here, the anger eventually is going to divert more of that cholesterol molecule to cortisol and stress, and you will be slowly depleting testosterone. Now, going into this, you'll have plenty of testosterone, but after a couple days, there have been very interesting studies showing that testosterone doesn't necessarily drop with sleep deprivation. That's a bit of a myth. The takeaway from all of this is, if you can just convince yourself, or ideally, if you can just enjoy yourself, you are going to maintain or maybe even increase testosterone stores, which will make effort feel good. And to me, aside from neuroplasticity, where everything becomes automatic after this experience, to me, that's the holy grail. When effort feels good, life just gets way better. And we're not talking about achieving the reward. I'm not talking about the end of this thing. I'm talking about the process of it feeling really good.
Dr. Huberman's wisdom guides us to a path where effort becomes an exhilarating experience, unlocking your true potential. Imagine the boundless possibilities, the unyielding progress, and the unstoppable beast within that awaits realization. Through understanding and embracing the importance of effort, we can transform ourselves into the ultimate version of who we're meant to be.
Hormones are powerful. The relationship between thoughts and hormones and these physiological things is enormous. I had a colleague that a few years ago, he was dying of pancreatic cancer, and I was interviewing him just because he's an important figure in our community, and I was a friend. And there was one day where he told me, he said, I don't want to make it past the new year. And it was crushing for me to hear. And I knew that he had been on some androgen therapy for a whole set of other things. And I said, have you taken your androgen cream? And he was like, no, I haven't done it. Go get it for me. I have this on film. He takes it, he puts the androgen cream on. 10 minutes later, he says, you know what? I think I want to live into the new year, and I'm going to write 12 letters of recommendation. And he did. And so there's something about these molecules that in an ancient way, in all organisms, all mammals as far as we know, are linked to the will to live. They're linked to effort and making effort feel good, which has been fundamental to the evolution of our species. I always say, people think that the opposite of testosterone is estrogen, but it's not. The opposite of testosterone is prolactin, which makes us feel quiescent and not in pursuit of things, etc. Testosterone makes effort feel good. Estrogen makes emotions feel okay.
Dr. Huberman emphasizes the significance of achieving a harmonious balance between estrogen and testosterone for our emotional well-being. This equilibrium paves the way for a stronger, more resilient emotional foundation, allowing us to navigate life's challenges with grace and fortitude.
So just as there are behaviors that can increase testosterone, there are behaviors that can decrease testosterone. And one of the most well-characterized ones in humans is becoming a parent. Expecting fathers have an almost 50% decrease in testosterone levels, both free and bound testosterone. As well, their cortisol levels, a stress hormone, drop by almost threefold, which is incredible. And their estradiol levels double. So their estrogen levels double. So expecting fathers, many people have known, put on additional body weight. Everyone always thought that it's because they're eating in parallel with their pregnant wife. But it turns out that these effects of reduced testosterone, increased estradiol, and reduced cortisol can all be explained by an increase in prolactin. So not just in humans, but in other species as well, when the male and female of that species are expecting young, they lay down more body fat. The assumption is that this is to prepare for long nights of no sleep, which occurs in many species, not just in humans. So it's really interesting that this hormone prolactin can start suppressing whole categories of hormones, sex steroid hormones, and can start increasing whole categories of other ones. So we hear about the dad bod. There are a lot of explanations for the dad bod, but it is a well-known phenomenon that testosterone is going to drop, prolactin is going to increase, estradiol is going to increase in males and females that are expecting children. The other behavior that markedly reduces testosterone in both males and females and markedly reduces the desire for seeking sex and sex itself is illness. And many of you might say, well, duh, when people feel sick, they don't feel like seeking out mates, they don't feel like having sex. But have you ever wondered why that actually is? Well, it turns out that it can be explained by the release of what are called inflammatory cytokines. So cytokines are related to the immune system, they travel in the lymph and in the blood, and they attack invader cells like bacteria and viruses. And under conditions of illness, we make a lot of different cytokines. Some of them are anti-inflammatory, but some of them are pro-inflammatory. And the best known example of a pro-inflammatory cytokine is IL-6. And it's known that IL-6, when injected into individuals, will decrease the desire for sex and eventually will reduce levels of testosterone and estrogen, independent of feeling lousy. So the reason why people don't want sex when they're sick is because levels of IL-6 are increased. Now, this is important because as we start to think about the different ways to modulate the sex steroid hormones, so-called optimize the hormones, in short and put simply, inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 are bad for sex steroid hormones. We all know, because now we've been told a lot in the last decade or so, that getting proper sleep is important for all these aspects of health. Getting proper sleep can really offset all the reductions in testosterone and estrogen and reductions in fertility that occur if we don't get enough sleep. But seldom is it discussed how sleep actually adjusts things like testosterone and estrogen. And it does it by modifying cortisol. So the molecule cholesterol can be converted into testosterone or estrogen, but there's a competition whereby the cholesterol will turn into cortisol and not testosterone, or it'll turn into cortisol and not estrogen if stress levels are too high. So the simple version of this is getting your breathing right during the waking hours, meaning primarily, unless you're working out really hard or there's some other reason why you're maybe eating or speaking, you need to be breathing through your mouth, you should be a nose breather. There's really good evidence for that now. And in sleep, you also want to be a nose breather because that's going to increase the amount of oxygen that you're bringing into your system and the amount of carbon dioxide that you're offloading. There are other positive effects of it as well, but you're basically reducing apnea. Breath holding in sleep leads to buildup of carbon dioxide and leads to increases in cortisol, which then decrease testosterone and decrease estrogen in negative ways,
across all sexes. Okay, so the simple version of this is get your breathing right. So how do you do that? How do you get your breathing right? Well, for some people that have severe sleep apnea, they're going to need the CPAP machine. This is a machine that you actually put on your face and it helps you breathe properly in sleep. In the daytime, the best way to get good at nasal breathing is to dilate the nasal passages, because a lot of people have a hard time breathing through their nose. And one way to do this is to just breathe through your nose more. And one way to do that is that when you exercise, in particular cardiovascular exercise, most of the time, provided you're not in maximum effort, you should be nasal breathing. Becoming a nasal breather can have all sorts of positive effects by reducing cortisol, reducing apnea, and indirectly raising testosterone and estrogen in the proper ratios. So this might seem kind of foundational and indirect, but when you go into the scientific literature, it comes through as one of the most powerful things that you can do that is zero cost. It takes a little effort, but it's zero cost, and it has all these positive effects across the board, both cosmetic and in sleep and hormonal, etc. Viewing bright light within the first hour of waking, whether or not it's from artificial light or ideally from sunlight, has these powerful effects on sleep and wakefulness. But we have to return to this if you want to understand how light can impact hormones, because hormones, light and dopamine have a very close-knit relationship, so much so that your light viewing behavior can actually have a direct effect on hormone levels and fertility. It can have a direct effect on hormone levels and libido. It can have a direct effect on hormone levels and your ability to heal quickly. Several species of animals, many species of animals in fact, like rabbits and fox and various mustelids like ferrets and ermines, change their pelage color across the seasons. So dopamine has a precursor. That precursor is tyrosine, which is an amino acid, comes from food. But the precursor to a lot of the melanin-producing elements of cells that give pigmentation, including for the hair, is tyrosine and tyrosinase, an enzyme. So yes, the same amino acid-based pathway and many of the same enzymes that are devoted to dopamine and dopamine increasing the sex steroid hormones are devoted to giving pigmentation to the hair and skin. And this is why in the summer months, when days are longer, animals are breeding more. And this is also why in the winter months, when days are shorter, animals are breeding less. This is also why in humans, many people, not all, feel an elevation in mood in the spring and summer months because of the amount of sunlight they're getting is increased relative to the winter months. Increased viewing of sunlight, and it has to be to the eyes, it's not to the skin. Increased viewing of sunlight increases dopamine levels in the brain. Increased dopamine levels in animals and humans increases the amount of these melanocytes and the activity of these melanin-producing cells, which give pigmentation to the skin and hair, and indirectly increase the amount of testosterone and estrogen, and thereby reproductive behavior, feelings of well-being, social interactions, reductions in anxiety, etc. All of which should make sense based on what we've talked about already in terms of the biology and the impact of these steroid hormones on various aspects of the mind and body. This translates to the protocol of, if you want to optimize testosterone and estrogen, you need to get your light viewing behavior correct. It's not just about optimizing your sleep, which is also important. It's about getting sufficient amount of light in your eyes so you have sufficient levels of dopamine. It means getting anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes of bright light exposure in your eyes early in the day. It is not sufficient to do this with sunglasses unless you have to do that for safety reasons. It's fine to wear prescription lenses and contacts. If you can't get sunlight for whatever reason, you want to use bright artificial light. But that is absolutely critical for timing the cortisol release properly, limiting cortisol release to the early part of the day, getting increases in dopamine that are going to promote the production of testosterone and estrogen to healthy levels. The other aspect of light viewing behavior that's extremely important is to avoid bright light exposure to your eyes in the middle of the night. If you're viewing bright light in the middle of the night, you are suppressing dopamine release. If you're suppressing dopamine release, you are suppressing testosterone levels.